we welcome Miss Bridget McEvoy. She's a registered dietitian with URS Medical. Hi, Bridget. How are you?
Oh, good. Thank you for having me.
So we will start her presentation here shortly, but for those that are joining us for the first time, I want to talk a little bit about our SARE Early Head Start program. So SARE National has a partnership agreement with Grand Prairie Independent School District to deliver early Head Start services to 72 infants and toddlers. Their age range is from 6 weeks to 3 years of age. And we actually have two centers, the Little Coyote Learning Center and the Little Dragon Learning Center. And you can see more about each one of our centers on our website. So we welcome you to visit our website to get more information. So Bridget, we are going to go ahead and start with your presentation. Do you have any words before we start?
Sure, I'm going to introduce myself as soon as we get the presentation up. So I'm going to share here. All right. So again, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to present today. This is probably one of my favorite topics to speak on and work with families regarding picky eating. So today the topic is going to be combating picky eaters and feeding is parenting. So before we get started, I'm going to share a little bit about myself. I am a registered dietitian nutritionist. One of the questions I get most often is what is a dietitian and how is that different from a nutritionist? Are they the same? So the difference between a registered dietitian and a nutritionist is that if you are a registered dietitian, all dietitians have the same education. They have the same continuing education for years after they become licensed. We all go through a very strict and challenging accredited program requiring the same amount of clinical hours and practice. And then we pass a board exam and we become licensed and registered in our state. So a nutritionist, anybody can be a nutritionist. There isn't a standard of education to qualify yourself as a nutritionist like there is with a dietitian. So I encourage you, if you are doing some research, some questions maybe about feeding and nutrition for your kiddos, to try to look for information that has been shared by a dietitian. That way you know that it's founded on evidence and research and you're getting most updated and current information that's best for your child. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about my background. So I kind of grew up in my career with the City of Dallas WIC program. I spent almost a decade there where I was responsible for developing curriculum for parents, for education classes, and also training our dietitians and our nutritionists to make sure they were giving the best counseling and assessments possible to our families. During my time at WIC, worked with so many families that had challenges with picky eaters and had goals that they were trying to achieve with their kids just to improve their well-being overall. So this is a topic that is not foreign to me. Worked with this a lot over the years. I also worked in particular with children that were a little bit more high risk and pregnant women, meaning that they were underweight or overweight, had gestational diabetes, families that needed a little bit extra care and maybe had an underlying medical condition. During that time at WIC, I was asked to participate in the Early Head Start Policy Council. I have been doing that for, I think, maybe close to 4 years, which is really near and dear to my heart because I can tell you a trend that I saw when I worked at WIC for those 9 years is that children that were enrolled in either Early Head Start or Head Start really had greater developed communication skills, language skills, were meeting the milestones. And one thing I noticed as well, there was a correlation between those kids and receiving that education and that structure and healthy eating. Those kids tended to be a little bit more flexible with their eating habits. And so we're going to go over that in length today. And lastly, I also participate in the Early Head Start Medical Advisory Board, and I currently work for URS Medical. I kind of pivoted in my career about 1.5 years ago, and now I work with more critically ill children and help them transition from a medical hospital setting to their homes. It is not allowing me to go to the next. Raul, it's not allowing me to go to the next slide. There we go. So the objectives of today's presentation is we're going to go over a little bit of the history of infant and toddler feeding. I think it helps us understand where we are today with the recommendations and how we feed our children. We're going to define what a picky eater is, define the division of responsibility. That's something that's really going to be the foundation of today's presentation. We're going to speak on that and learn a lot about that today. Understanding the feeding relationship and how it affects food regulation, understanding mealtime mechanics, and tips for building a confident eater. So feeding versus nutrition. So what's the difference? So feeding is an umbrella term, and nutrition is a small component of feeding. So feeding is parenting. Feeding is understanding child development, the feeding dynamics, positive family interaction, and nutrition is just a small part of that, because we have to build trust with our children. We can't control what actually enters their body in terms of food, but we can control what food that we're offering them and the environment that we're creating around food. So that is going to be explained in the division of responsibility, which is something that Ellen Satter, who really is the pioneer and the expert in this area, we really look to her for our guidance in the medical community. She is a registered dietitian and now is a psychotherapist. And so we have really learned a lot from her practice. And so today I'm kind of going to be basing this presentation on the education she's brought to us, but also my experience from putting that into practice over the last 10 years. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little history, not a whole lot, because unless you're a nutrition nerd, this isn't that interesting to you. But I want you to understand the history of feeding and nutrition, only because at some point you've probably wondered, why is it that a physician who's been practicing for 40 years may be giving me completely different feeding advice and nutrition advice than a pediatrician who's been practicing for 5 years? Or why is it that the WIC program is providing me, and maybe Early Head Start is providing me with nutrition and feeding information that is very different than what my grandmother is instructing me to do? Nutrition is a ever-evolving science, and a lot has changed over the years. So I'm going to go back to the 1920s. So in 1920s, when we really discovered the role that vitamins have in our health. So we discovered that if we're eating a balanced diet and we're getting these vitamins, we're not going to suffer from nutritional deficiencies leading to other health complications. So what did that do? Well, science took it to an excruciating extreme and started controlling all of the food that we were giving to our children. So the pediatricians were recommending, enforcing, just kind of dictating all the food that children ate, the types and the quantities, because they wanted to ensure they were getting all of these vitamins. Well, historically, it doesn't tell us what this did emotionally to the children by having no autonomy on their feeding. But I think that our imagination can explain can really give us an idea of probably the effect that that had on our children. So luckily in 1928, Clara Davis, a pediatrician, she published the studies that we now still refer to this day for healthy infant and child feeding. She published these studies at New York's Mount Sinai Hospital. This demonstrated that children do not need to have every nutrient control that goes into their body. If you put healthy food in front of them, create a healthy environment, those children will self-feed and choose those foods and will be healthy. In the 1930s, there was a shift from breastfeeding to formula feeding. So this also introduced rigid feeding practices. So something that we're going to talk about later on in the presentation is how important it is to let children's genetic blueprint determine how much they eat, right? Just like us. So we eat not according to a schedule, but when our gut tells us we're hungry, when we feel hunger pangs. So what happened when we had this shift from breastfeeding to formula feeding, we put the breastfed babies, when they're feeding from the breast, it's demand feeding, right? They're letting us know when they're hungry. Anyone who's breastfed knows you try to get a baby to feed from the breast that's full, it is not going to happen. So they don't feed on a schedule, especially early on. Well, when we introduced the formula feeding and there was that shift, we introduced schedules. So we took a baby that once was feeding on demand, telling us when they were hungry, listening to their feeding cues, abiding by their genetic blueprint. We put them on a schedule to eat every 3 to 4 hours. So we were either making them wait until that 3 to 4 hour time period to feed, or we were feeding them even if they weren't hungry. So this was teaching them to ignore their instincts. So in 1937, the Journal of American Medical Association recommended to start introducing solids to our babies at 4 to 6 months. So yay, no more crazy feeding recommendations. They're now realizing the importance of waiting to give babies real food until 4 to 6 months. So we're going to kind of breeze through this. So in the 70s, it's no surprise that we still continue to ignore the recommendations. When I first learned of this, I just kind of chuckled to myself because I kind of think of in the 70s, I see a pregnant woman, you know, with a cigarette and a cocktail, or your doctor at your OB visit smoking a cigarette. So it was no surprise that in the 70s, kind of all of these recommendations that were being published and we were kind of turning a corner all went by the wayside. Luckily, in the 80s and the 90s, the Committee of Nutrition really took a stand, and we still stand behind the guidelines that they introduced, and that is what we currently follow today, which is to wait to introduce solid foods to babies until 4 to 6 months of age, preferably closer to the 6-month mark. Okay, so what is a picky eater? So first we're going to talk about what a picky eater is not. So a picky eater is not a child who is hypersensitive to foods or hyperselective. Usually a child who has hypersensitivity or hyperselectivity usually has an underlying issue such as autism spectrum disorder, sensory processing issues, or a texture aversion or intolerance. So today we are not talking about kiddos who are overweight, who are underweight, who have underlying health issues, who are receiving, special speech therapy and feeding therapy to overcome some issues that's interfering with being able to eat. That is not what we're talking about today. We're talking about a typical healthy child without any underlying medical concerns. So what is a picky eater? A picky eater is every eater. So picky eating is defined by the expectations of parents or caregivers. So this is often shaped by social pressures or inaccurate feeding advice. And also, what do all parents want for their children? They want their children to be healthy and happy and safe and successful. So to be healthy and happy and safe and successful, you have to have good nutrition. That is one thing that parents, it's important for them to provide. So if they feel that maybe they're not meeting the expectations of maybe the physician or their peers, sometimes they can label their own child as a picky eater because they're comparing their children to somebody else or standards of another adult. So less confident eaters and poor feeding habits are typically driven by the absence of division of responsibility. So we're going to get more into that later on. But typically, poor eating habits do coincide with less structure in the home, particularly around feeding. And something to think about too. So if you have a picky eater at home, or if you don't, and you have a toddler at home, preschool age, all children, small children of preschool age, are neophobic, meaning they're scared of new food. And they're scared of anything new. So aside from being fearful of a new fruit or a vegetable, they're kind of scared to try anything, right? They're apprehensive. So we need to keep that in mind when we're working with them and introducing new foods. Sometimes they're not being picky or being defiant or difficult. It's just a part of their development. Okay, so common feeding concerns of parents. I'm sure this probably resonates if you're an educator or you're a parent. You've heard at least one of these. My child is eating too little, is eating too much, is too thin, is too big, only wants junk food, doesn't eat enough vegetables, won't eat the meals I prepare for the family, won't eat meals at the table, only wants to drink milk and juice, wants cereal for every meal, or wants to snack all day. So I'm sure if I could see you all, we could raise a hand if you've heard at least one of these concerns. I would see quite a few hands. So eating can be, and feeding your child can be stressful. So I couldn't help myself. I had to include this little picture. So it says stressed is dessert spelled backwards. So I'm sure there's times where you thought, oh, I wish I could just feed them donuts for dinner or cupcakes. It would just be so much easier. So, and no, as a dietitian, I'm not endorsing stress eating and eating a cake when you're stressed, but we have to find humor in these things, right? So what is this division of responsibility that I keep mentioning? So parents are responsible for certain aspects of feeding, and children are as well. So parents are responsible for what? So what you're feeding your children, when, so what time, and where. Is that in front of the TV? Is that at the dinner table? Is that the drive-through? And children also have responsibility. They're responsible for how much they're eating and whether they're eating. So the good news is the parents have no control, and they're allowed to give themselves a pass on how much a child eats and whether or not they eat at all. But there are structure and things that you can implement in your home that will kind of help gear those kids to eat a good, healthy amount and determine whether or not they eat. So creating this dynamic allows a child to rely on their genetic blueprint to guide to eating. So eating is a set of complex skills your child will learn over time with your guidance. The more a child is pushed, the slower they will learn. So if we're at the dinner table and we're saying, just try it, just take a bite, you'll like it. You have to eat your peas before we'll let you get up from the table. The slower they will learn. And we must respect their autonomy, but also set limits. Something that's really important, now this is all based on trust, which we're going to talk more about. Feeding is based on developing trust with your child. So there's probably been a time in your life where someone said, oh, just try this, just try it, you'll like it. And you know you're not going to like it, and you try it, and it still doesn't taste good to you. I just had a conversation with a colleague before this presentation about milk. I've been trying to convince myself to like milk for about 30 years, and I can't do it. Every time I try it, it still tastes bad to me. So if you have a small child who's already nervous about trying new foods, and you say, hey, just try it, you'll like it. I promise, this is mommy's favorite food, you'll like it. And they don't like it, what happens? Now they feel like they can't trust you when it comes to feeding. So we have to be really careful about how we encourage and speak to our children around food. So your number one job with feeding is food selection. A child must have regular exposure to a variety of healthful foods, and this includes foods that you may not eat yourself. I cannot tell you how many families I worked with, and I say, Bridget, I just really want little Johnny to eat more vegetables. He does not eat vegetables. And I say, okay, well, tell me what vegetables you prepare at home. They're like, ooh, I don't like vegetables. I don't cook vegetables. So unless these kids are being exposed to these foods, and also seeing you try these foods and kind of try to expand your palate, they're not going to learn to like these foods either. So feeding relationship and food regulation. So the great news is kids know how much to eat. So many parents ask me, well, how do I know they're getting enough? Well, if they're eating and they're full and they stop, you know that they're getting enough. Just like us, well, as adults, we tend to push past our fullness cues if food really tastes good, but children tend to follow their instincts and genetic blueprint and not push past fullness unless they are taught to. So a lot of parents say my child's not eating enough, or they want seconds or thirds at dinner. So the healthy feeding relationship allows the focus to shift away from the amount a child consumes at mealtime. You provide the food, the healthy meal, and then the child determines how much. So what is the parent's responsibility? Again, the type of food, the environment, and when. And then the child will determine how much they consume. So again, appropriate feeding is built on trust. Feeding should be a priority, not an obsession. So there have been so many families that I've worked with where they're so consumed by improving their children's feeding habits that it does become an obsession. It becomes the focus of conversation at dinner. It becomes the focus of conversation between the parents. They're talking about the feeding and the child eating better to the child every day. When it becomes an obsession like that, it starts to create an unhealthy relationship with food. And now we are not creating a confident eater. We are actually creating some insecurities with this child, because this child doesn't understand where you're coming from as a parent. All they know that they are being spoken to about their food constantly, and they're told to do something different than what feels natural to them. So we want to optimize feeding and nutrition and celebrate and provide healthy food. So what does this look like? So we're talking about this division of responsibility. So let's put this into real practice. So the parents are responsible for controlling what comes into the house. So you provide the food, the feeding environment, and then guess what? You get to let go, which is nice because there's not a whole lot that as parents we get to let go of, right? So you control what comes into the house, making the meals and presenting them. Looks matter. We want to make sure the plate looks nice, the food looks appealing. Isn't that one of the nicest things about going out to dinner? You get this beautiful plate. Before you even know what it tastes like, you want to try that meal. So insisting that the children show up for meals, they don't have a choice. That is non-negotiable. They must come to the table and sit at dinner time. Making meal times pleasant. So this is not the time where we talk about our boss is breathing down our neck, or, you know, little Johnny got a C on the report card, Sally hit his brother and got the iPad taken away. This is talking about our highs of the day, joking around, being silly. Even you could, if you have really little kids, singing silly songs about fruit and vegetables. It should be a pleasant time. Teaching kids to behave at the table. Regulating timing and content of snacks. So if children don't have an appetite, of course they're not going to eat, no matter how beautiful that meal is. And then teaching good table manners is very important. So let's break it down. So if you were going to implement this in your home, this would look like you want to schedule meals around the same time every day. You want to provide healthy and tasty foods at each meal. The food should taste good, right? And what helps to make a balanced plate for children is following the My Plate method. So we're going to kind of dig into these little bullet points later on in the presentation. I'll give you some more examples. Explore various methods of cooking. So instead of maybe just boiling vegetables, try grilling, roasting, putting them in the crock pot, making feeding fun, cooking together. I'll tell you, I believe one of the most effective, probably the top 2 tips of helping kids explore new foods is having them cook with you. We're going to get more into this later, but there's so many times parents have said, oh my gosh, I tried that and I couldn't believe I can't get her to eat anything. And she grabbed a raw onion and just put it in her mouth and ate it. And I could recall a time where I was cooking with my nieces and I was cutting up a raw potato. One of them grabbed it and popped it in her mouth and she thought it was just great. So when you're in that environment of cooking together, it's safe, you're building trust, and they don't associate that environment or that experience with eating or trying new foods. So exploring new textures, talking about if foods are gritty, grainy, if they're smooth, if they're crunchy, learning about new foods together. And no pressure feeding, which we touched on a little bit. The more you push, the more they're going to push back. Offer new foods multiple times, avoiding food rewards for eating, and having realistic expectations. Kids are like us. They have food preferences. They're not going to like everything, just like we don't like everything. And then, of course, be patient. So reliability of regular feeding. So this is why it's so important that we have scheduled meals for our kids, typically around the same time every day. Of course, it's not always going to be perfect, but this builds trust. If kids are having to think about being fed, it's breaking that trust and it's causing them to feel insecure around food and feeding. So if meals and snacks are predictable, the child doesn't have to think about being fed. So also if regular meal times are scheduled, our appetite becomes trained. So just like if you get up very early every day, kind of your body clock gets used to that, you wake up around the same time every day. Well, eating is very similar. So we know that if our kiddos are eating around the same time every day and they're having appropriate snacks in between, they should have an appetite for their lunch and their dinner. Also, new routines can be intimidating for a child. So having the foundation of trust is key when combating these picky eating habits. Another thing, sitting and eating with your child, not necessarily providing food for the little ones, we would have to do that. But still, when you are feeding with a spoon, if your child's unable to self-feed, still not making it about eating. Making it fun, having conversation, being silly, talking about the food that we're eating. And if a child doesn't eat, that's okay. You can actually tell them, you know what, I'm really proud of you for not eating because you're not hungry. That's good. We don't want to eat when we're not hungry. I'm going to put it in the fridge and we're going to pull it back out maybe in 30 minutes or so when you're hungry. Now, that is really helpful when you have a child who's used to playing games, who just doesn't want to eat because they're used to maybe getting a second option. So if you have one of those kiddos who's used to asking for like a corn dog or a bowl of cereal instead of eating with the family, that is a really, really good tactic. So again, avoid short order cooking. That is going to train your child that mealtime is negotiable. That will train any kiddo to not eat what's prepared for them at mealtime. So if you're cooking food for the family, and then your child has the option of requesting something different, and so then you're cooking for them and maybe cooking something else for another child, you're creating an environment of where the child is in control of the food that is coming into the house. That division of responsibility has now gotten out of balance, and these kids are going to be trained to negotiate at every meal. Maybe be good later in life if they become salespeople, but not easy for you when you're trying to feed your family. And repetitive food offering. So kids may need to be exposed to new foods up to 15 times before they learn to like them. So don't give up. So if you try, let's say, sauteed carrots or roasted carrots, and your child leaves them on the plate, doesn't like them, that's okay. Maybe next week, try raw carrots dipped in low-fat ranch. So kind of recreate the foods that you're introducing, but also introduce them multiple times. Okay, so how do we know what to put on a plate? How do we make a healthy plate? So healthy eating doesn't have to be complicated. I think a lot of times we get caught up in serving sizes and how many cups of vegetables do I need a day? Well, what is a cup of vegetables? What does that look like? To keep it simple, you can look at your plate, and this is for adults and for children, and half of the plate should be fruits and vegetables. So now, does it have to be divided up into these little compartments? No. Think about if you were eating a salad. If you had lettuce, you had tomato, you had chicken, you had maybe some croutons. Well, now you have all of those components, fruits, grains, vegetables, and protein, but it's not going to be arranged exactly like that plate, and that's okay. We want to look at the plate and make sure for our kids there is color on there. Here in America, we have no problem getting in our tan foods on our plate, meaning our breads, our cereal, our rice, our beans, our chicken, our beef, our fish, bagels, chips. We have no problem getting that on the plate. But a lot of time that plate is very beige and it's lacking green and red and yellow and blue. And that's what we want to make sure is on the plate at every meal. So it does not have to be complicated. Just look for color. All right, so something that is really fun for kids, because they don't want to hear about the benefits of fruits and vegetables. We know why it's important. We know that we need to eat them, but they, really couldn't care less, right? So we want to make it fun for them and enticing. So eating the rainbow seems to really be effective. So talking to them in terms of color instead of maybe the health benefits, it's good to do both, but we really want to grab their attention. So you can use fruits and vegetables to teach them their colors instead of maybe doing flashcards. Use grocery shopping as a teaching moment. So we all know that it can be a little bit dreadful to take the kids to the grocery store sometimes. They get bored, I don't blame them. So something that you can do to keep them entertained is to learn about the different fruits and vegetables. So when you're shopping for your essentials, You can say, okay, there's an apple. What color is an apple? Does it grow from the ground or does it come from a tree? And you can kind of make this whole shopping experience, which usually can be kind of dreadful, this fun bonding moment and teaching moment. Also, you can allow every week your child to select a new fruit and vegetable that you can prepare at home. So say cauliflower is not something that you typically prepare at home, and the kiddo chooses cauliflower. Well, you guys can together cook that, prepare that. Maybe you want to roast it or look on Google and find like a mashed cauliflower recipe. Together, you can discover these new foods. And then lastly, make a rainbow chart. So you guys can make this together, or you can find them online. And at the end of the day or throughout the day, your kiddo and yourself can put a little sticker after every color that they eat. And it kind of becomes a fun little game for them, and they are proud of their accomplishments when they see that on the chart. What they don't know is they're eating all these healthy things, right? Like what we're concerned about is the fiber and the phytochemicals, right? But all they know is that they're getting stickers and it's an achievement. So building memories in the kitchen. So again, this is one of the most effective tips for getting your child to be a confident eater. Not only do they learn how to cook, but they also build memories with the parents. It is really important that our children look back and have great memories from their childhood. And cooking with their parents is just so fantastic. I think for most families, our traditions and our memories are built around food, right? And so we want our kids to look back and have these positive memories. And not only will it kind of remove that fear of that exposure to new foods and get them interested in trying it, they will just have a really positive experience. Also, kids tend to be a little bit egocentric. This preschool age, it's kind of all about them. So if it's something that they prepared, they were a part of, they're proud of, then they are more likely to try it because it's theirs. So I included a cookbook here because a lot of parents are like, well, that sounds great in theory, but what in the world do I have a 2-year-old do in the kitchen with me? And it can be kind of scary, right? So I included this cookbook. The WIC program uses this a lot in their education. So it is both in Spanish and English. And what's really fantastic about it is that each instruction is numbered. And the ones that are in color, so if they're highlighted in purple or green or yellow, those are the steps that the child can participate in the kitchen. Something else that's really nice is that these recipes were developed around the WIC foods. So there's not a lot of expensive or hard to find ingredients. It's very common ingredients, and you can make substitutes. So for example, there's a really great smoothie recipe in here made with soy milk. Well, of course, you could use whatever milk that you desire. So food should taste good. So again, I can't tell you how many times I heard families say, gosh, they're not eating vegetables. And I said, okay, well, tell me what vegetables you're offering and how you prepare them. And they say, oh, I do, boil them on the stove, or I do like the steam in the bag. I'm like, okay, great. And like, yeah, I just put it on the plate. I'm like, okay, so you add butter or seasoning? And they're like, no. I'm like, oh, so it's just like the boiled vegetables. Yeah. And I thought, well, do you like that? They're like, no. So, don't be afraid to make the vegetables taste good. I think there's this belief that if the vegetables aren't just by themselves on the plate, they don't have any seasoning or any flavor, that it doesn't count. It does count, even if they taste good and they're mixed into your other food. No one wants to eat something that's bland and has no flavor. So don't be afraid to try new ways of cooking food. So roasting vegetables, for example. Unfortunately, there's not very many foods that I don't like. I really enjoy eating, but boiled carrots is on my list of I don't love it very much. But you take those same boiled carrots and you roast them, and they're caramelized with salt and pepper. They transform into a different food. So it's really important to try different ways of cooking than maybe you're used to. You can grill your vegetables. You can blend your vegetables into your favorite sauces. Add them to soups. Use peanut butter or yogurt for dipping, or low-fat ranch. There's a really great recipe of plain yogurt and peanut butter that you can mix together and dip fruit and vegetables in. That's fantastic. And seasoning, don't be afraid to season. Yes, use garlic and pepper and cumin and all these things that are going to enhance the flavors in the fruits and vegetables. You can add vegetables to meats and pasta dishes. You can add fruits and vegetables to your favorite pizza. And you can recreate your guilty pleasures like burgers and French fries at home. So you can take that buttered up bun, that fried patty, and you can go home and you can make maybe get whole grain buns, and you can make your own patties. You can even add veggies to them. You can bake your own French fries. I know the air fryer is all the rage these days. I don't have one yet, but making your vegetables in the air fryer is really delicious. Okay, so here's an example of getting creative. This is out of the cookbook that we reviewed earlier. So we've taken just your regular old mac and cheese, and now we have eggs in there, and we also have broccoli. So you can see where it's highlighted in green on the steps. Those are the steps that the children can get in the kitchen and participate and help. There's also fun facts too at the bottom of some of these recipes, and also it does break down the nutrition information. So this is actually a breakfast dish, but of course, if you wanted to make this as a side dish for lunch or dinner, of course, that would work as well. So this is just a good example of kind of getting out of your comfort zone and getting creative and finding ways to make these veggies more interesting and tasty. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about sometimes foods. So sometimes foods are exactly that. They should be enjoyed sometimes. So when this gets out of balance, and sometimes foods are offered most of the time or all of the time, there won't be enough room in the diet for nutritious food. For example, if you, in your dining room, if you filled your dining room with chairs, there's not going to be any space for a table. Well, it works the same way with the diet. Even if your children love vegetables and have no difficulty eating a variety of foods, if the diet is full of sometimes foods, there's just no room for those nutritious foods. Also, something that tends to happen when we eat a diet that's rich in fat and salt and sugar, our taste preference leans towards those foods. So you might hear people say, oh, I had to kind of retrain my taste buds because I had to cut back on the salt. So when you're used to eating those really, like a pizza rich in, fat and salt, your body and your taste buds really start to want those foods, and you don't appreciate more natural foods like fruits and vegetables. So of course, we all know what sometimes foods include. That's going to be your candy, your ice cream, your donuts, your sodas, your cakes, cookies, sweet drinks, fast foods, and chips. So the appreciation of sometimes foods. So your child will learn to appreciate the occasional donut or ice cream when it's available, when its availability is limited or offered during times of celebration. Think about if we had wedding cake or if we had birthday cake every week or every month, it wouldn't be special. It wouldn't be anything to look forward to. Or say we went to the beach, say, we live somewhere where there is no beach, but we went every weekend. It wouldn't be as exciting as when we take that annual vacation. So food is no different. We want our kids to appreciate when they get these foods that are typically enjoyed during a time of celebration. So I can think back and, remember probably all the times that I had donuts with my family and we went to the donut shop because it didn't happen very often. So if my parents had taken us to the donut shop every week or even every day, it wouldn't stick out to me in my mind as a special memory. And what's very important, we're talking about limiting these sometimes foods, but it's very important to understand no foods are forbidden. And it's important to avoid labeling food as good or bad. So we never would want our child to go to sit at a birthday party and get a cupcake and sit down to enjoy that. And then they hear in their mind a conversation that their mom had with a friend or with them saying, it's fattening or it's bad, there's too much sugar or there's gluten in it, because everybody demonizes gluten these days. You don't want your children to have a negative association with any type of food. No food is off limits. They can be enjoyed. They just have to be enjoyed not as often as our healthy foods. So drinking and grazing. So appetite is key. So if we're doing all of these things, this division of responsibility, everything's going great, but your child has no appetite, well, they're not going to eat, right? So it's really important to limit drinks and then snacks throughout the day. So juice, milk, and sugary beverages should be limited because they will eliminate or reduce the appetite. I can't tell you how many children I saw who were basically living on a liquid diet because they drank enough juice and milk to where they just didn't have an appetite. And so that's all that they wanted. And that is just not ideal for our kids' growth and development. So you want to limit the juice to 4 ounces per day. Keep in mind, kids do not need juice. They don't have to have juice, but if they are drinking it, 4 ounces per day is what's recommended, and limiting your milk to 16 ounces a day. So a lot of times I would see these kiddos drinking 24 to 48 ounces of milk a day. So they weren't eating enough solid food, but also tend to develop iron deficiency anemia because of the excess calcium. We also want our kids to be getting calcium and vitamin D from other food sources other than milk. So that's really important. And then, of course, our sugary drinks like flavored milk, sodas, Gatorades, lemonades, fruit punch, Sunny D, Capri Suns, those are considered sometimes drinks. And then, of course, snacks should be limited to 1 to 2 between meals, at least several hours following a meal, and at least 1 to 2 hours before the next meal. We want to give the body a chance to develop an appetite for dinner or lunch. And also think about in the summertime, when you maybe went to the public pool or to a neighbor's house and you're playing all day and you get out of that pool and you're just ravenous. That's because you were exercising. Kids don't realize it like us. We recognize when we're exercising, they're just having fun. So when they're active, they develop a bigger appetite, and also it helps balance out those sometimes foods. They can burn off if they had a little extra sometimes foods that day. They can kind of burn those off and then develop an appetite for a healthy meal later. So have your cake and eat it too, just don't offer it as a reward. So dessert and treats should not be offered as a reward for eating. What will happen is kids will tend to overeat or force themselves to eat to be rewarded with dessert, which creates unhealthy eating patterns. It teaches them to eat past their fullness. So Ellen Satter, she actually suggests if dessert is already planned into the meal, to actually plate the dinner and then also plate the dessert at the meal as well. And from what she has discovered is that the children will eat their dessert, but obviously it's going to be a very small portion and not very much. They will circle back and eat the same amount of food as they would have from their dinner than if they had the dessert last. And she said that when she advises parents to try that, they are a little bit nervous and they're like, no way, they're going to eat the dessert and not touch their food. And she said that typically doesn't happen. So it's okay to incorporate the dessert in a healthy manner into the meal, but not holding that over their head to force them to eat, because what will happen is they will not have confidence to try new foods, and they won't learn to like new foods. They're just going to be force feeding, which is probably going to make them regress and not want to try new foods. So making feeding fun. So, we're talking about kids here. So anything fun is going to entice their attention. Presentation matters. So surprise your kiddo with a fun plate. So bring out the pancakes with strawberries as a smiley face, or have them help you in the kitchen come up with a fun plate. It doesn't have to be complicated. It is really interesting, though, if you search online creative kids plates, you can see some really incredible artwork from moms and dads. It's really impressive. But it doesn't have to be anything challenging or fancy. You can use cookie cutters. You can draw faces with condiments. Say meatloaf, for example, you could draw a smiley face with the ketchup. Arranging foods into shapes. Growing a garden. If you don't have yard, or you live in the concrete jungle like I do, you can get little containers. You can do container gardening and grow herbs and vegetables and spices. And you can go out and pick that while you're cooking with your child, and that really gets them interested in the cooking process and eating as well. Visit the community garden or farmer's market. Make up silly songs about fruits and vegetables. I'm sure you all remember that song, the banana song, the little kid song. I like to eat apples and bananas. Well, I guarantee you, no one made that song up because they thought that people would enjoy hearing a song about apples and bananas. It was to get kids interested in eating apples and bananas. So that does work too. And then make cooking a family matter. Getting everyone in the kitchen together, getting the kids involved, that is just very, very important. And like I said, will develop lifelong memories with your children. So feeding is parenting. These are the goals. So kind of in summary of everything that we talked about. So if we are putting into practice the division of responsibility in the household, what are our goals? What do we want our kids to achieve? So the goal of division of responsibility and utilizing these feeding tips for your preschool, the goal is for your preschooler to master the following competencies. So likes eating and feels good about it. There's not stress associated with going to the dinner table or going to the lunch table. Is interested in food, likes being at the table, can wait a few minutes where he or she is hungry, relies on internal cues of hunger or fullness, relies on variation in appetite to know what to eat, enjoys many different foods, can try new foods and learn to like them, can politely turn down food if he or she doesn't want to eat, can be around new or strange food without getting upset. And I'm going to kind of share a personal example of this. So on Father's Day, my mom made enchiladas, and which we all know are delicious. And my niece said, what are enchiladas? Which surprised me that a girl born and raised in Texas didn't know what enchiladas were. But I think she probably had them, but she didn't know what they were called. And she said, what are enchiladas? And my sister said, oh, tortilla and meat, if you like it, that's great. No pressure, didn't tell her she had to try it, put it on her plate. And later I said, did you try the enchiladas? She said, yeah. And I said, what do you think? She's like, they were so good. So that's an example that she was a confident eater. She didn't freak out. She didn't say, oh gosh, what is that? I've never seen that before. It looks gross. I'm not going to try it. Ew. That means that there is a little bit of insecurity surrounding eating. So that was a good example. If you develop a good confident eater, new foods are not going to intimidate them. And if she wouldn't have liked it, that would have been fine too. Also make sure that your child has reasonably good table manners. That's important. And that your child can make do with less than their favorite foods. So being okay with having, chicken and vegetables instead of pizza one night, and that they can eat comfortably in places other than home. So in conclusion, appropriate feeding is built on trust. So trust your child's ability to eat and grow the way that nature intended. Expect your child to grow according to their genes. Bodies come in all shapes and sizes. Optimize your child's nutrition versus controlling their eating. So don't restrict in an effort to control degenerative diseases or body shape. And the reason I put that in there is because these days there is a lot of pressure about surrounding raising children and health and wellness. There is this ideal that the food that we put in our body is going to make us indestructible, that you're either healthy or you're not, that you're not going to develop maybe diabetes or heart disease if you feed your child perfectly and you have a really good eater. That is not the case. There are certain things that are out of our control that we cannot manage just through diet. Some disease and then, of course, our body shape are two of those things. So we kind of have to let go of that. So you must be accepting of your child's size. It's okay for your child to have food preferences. Allow autonomy, but provide structure and limits. Again, we don't want to pressure. We can definitely encourage children to try foods, but you want to avoid pressuring. There is a technique that I did learn working with a speech therapist who works with children who have autism. And these kids are terrified of new food, sometimes even terrified of foods that they've been exposed to before. And something that she would do with kids that were very hyper selective, and I have some friends that have tried this with their kids at home. So if you have an eater and you're thinking, well, this all sounds like great information, but I don't even know where to start because my child won't touch a fruit or vegetable. Something that is an example of taking the shift from pressuring a child and choosing your words carefully is you could say something like this. You don't have to try the food. You can take the piece of pineapple, put it in your mouth, chew it once, and spit it out. Now the child doesn't feel pressured. They're not feeling that they have to eat the food. But typically what ends up happening is they're like, this pineapple is good, and they swallow it and they eat it. So that's another technique that you can use with your kiddos. So making feeding fun and pleasurable, and making memories. Again, I can't stress that enough. Making memories in the kitchen and around the dinner table, and to be physically active as a family together. Here are some resources. So myplate.gov is going to give you great examples of recipes, ways to get kiddos involved in the kitchen, how to build a healthy plate. The Texas WIC program has great resources. And then, of course, so Ellen Satter, the guru on feeding and nutrition for kiddos, she has 2 books that are really great resources. She has other books, but these I tend to refer to the most. Child of Mine, Feeding with Love and Good Sense, and How to Get Your Child to Eat, but Not Too Much. Also, if you are interested in purchasing the cookbook that we referred to earlier, I did find that on online at teamfornutrition.com. And here are some references, and then we are going to wrap it up with a really cute picture of my youngest niece enjoying some sometimes foods. And now we're going to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Bridget. That's so much information. I'm guilty of some of the things that you talked about as a parent, as an aunt as well. But I have definitely learned my lessons. So I completely advocate for flexibility, for parents to not stress as much about what your kids are eating, but more so what you're exposing them to. Now, I do have a question in the chat room, and the question is, the district cafeteria is now introducing more vegan choices to the menu. What do you think about a child being vegan?
If it is a religious preference, or if the child really has an aversion to meat, there are things that you can work around. You can provide, substitutes like beans and lentils. I think that if it's not necessary, it really is very restrictive and can be very challenging for the parents to make sure that the kids are getting all the nutrients they need on such a restricted diet.
And I do want to add to that, I was mentioning to Bridget earlier that I have a 6-year-old nephew that does not eat meat, and it's mainly because he doesn't like the texture of it. He has started eating chicken, but it was just on his own. So don't give up if your kids at first do not like it. Eventually they may come around, or they may just try it if it's on your plate, and then they may like it after that. And so
I think even if they're offering vegan entrees, doesn't necessarily mean that the child is vegan all the time. So of course, if we have a meatless meal, which is recommended, and we eat way more meat than we need, that's perfectly fine for a child to go an entire day without eating any animal protein. We balance out our diet. We make up for whatever we don't eat at one meal. Typically, we make it up the next day or the next meal. And like you said, it's okay if a child's not a huge fan of meat, no problem. You can work around that. Would I recommend a strictly defined vegan diet for a child? Probably not. I probably wouldn't.
Okay, so we also have another comment that came in, and it says, thank you for explaining the difference between a dietitian and nutritionist. I always wondered why I got different information from different nutritionists.
I want to mention that The WIC program is, I think, the only organization out there that does require their nutritionists to have specific education to work with the program. So they are the exception. So the nutritionists at the WIC program do have to have a bachelor's degree in nutrition, but they just aren't dietitians. But outside of the WIC program, anyone who is a nutritionist that is not a dietitian, it's kind of, you don't really know the information that you're going to get. They are not held to any type of standard, and they're not required by law to provide accurate and evidence-based information.
Okay, we also have another question. How can one wean kids if they're eating sometimes foods often, like chips, ice cream, more than 5 times a week?
Great question. I'm going to refer back to a couple families that I saw. This is to give you an example. There was a little girl I worked with for a really long time. When I first started seeing her, she only ate chips. That's not an exaggeration. That was the only food that she ate. And I was pretty confident that she didn't have an underlying medical disorder like autism or hyperselectivity. So I felt comfortable working with the family. So the first thing that I recommend, if there is a sometimes food that is causing you to, want to rip your hair out because the child is begging for it all the time, they want that instead of their meal, the best thing you can do is to get it out of the house. So remember, when we talk about division of responsibility, you control what food comes into the house. So what I would suggest is getting it out of the house for a couple weeks and then reintroducing that food as a sometimes food.
To mute myself. I think that's a great idea. We have started doing that with even our older kids, where, we want them to, because they're working out so much, we want them to eat food that is higher in protein or better calories and empty calories, like Rice Krispie treats and things like that. So now we don't buy them, and they don't even ask for them now that we don't buy them. And so I think it's a matter of, if it's there, they want it, type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. The power of suggestion.
Yes. I do have another question. You were talking about, how parents, and we talked about this earlier too, how parents sometimes feel pressured to follow certain guidelines, especially feeding schedules. What kind of advice can you give parents that are, they've been told that and they're set on every 3 to 4 hours?
Now, are you referring to infants?
Mm-hmm.
So as infants get older, it's okay for them to be on a schedule. If they're formula fed, they kind of will tend to put themselves on a schedule. But in the beginning, commonly what happens is when you're in the hospital and before you discharge, they say with your few-day-old baby, feed every 3 to 4 hours. So what I would advise, instead of following that type of schedule, is to educate yourself on feeding cues, what they look like, and follow those feeding cues. So some of those cues are going to be babies start sucking on their hands. They start rooting, which is like they turn their mouth like they're looking for the breast. So even bottle-fed babies do that in the beginning. Sometimes they clench their fists. They start waking up. They're getting restless. Crying is a late cue of hunger. So if babies are getting to the point where they're crying because they're hungry, that means we've ignored what they were trying to tell us before they started crying. And now they're so uncomfortable. They're like, Mom, feed me. So my advice would be to do a little research on hunger and feeding cues for babies. And that way you can recognize when they're trying to tell you that they're ready to feed.
Okay, Bridget, I want to thank you for joining us today. I think it was a wonderful presentation. I got a lot of information, even though our kids are older, but definitely, for the future, on new things to try with younger children, and to not feel as pressured as a parent to do what everybody else is doing. So I want to thank you for your presentation and your time for joining us. I also want to thank everyone that's watching us. Please join us in the future. You could visit our website for future Early Head Start events, as far as also our other events. One that I want to talk about is our president will be on July the 14th. He will be sharing a lot of information about SARE and all their programs, Early Head Start, San Mujer, CSEP, and our STEM programming. So please tune in on July 14th to hear a little bit more from him. Bridget, any last words?
Yes, I just wanted to add, while you were speaking, a comment popped up that asked about smoothies, and they were adding vegetables to the smoothies, and they asked if that was okay. You're awesome. That is a great idea. Adding those veggies to those smoothies, that's fantastic. That yes, continue doing that. That's great.